Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Hutchinson, Vice President of Education for the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to our virtual recordings for the 2022 Preparatory Conference for the Council's Junior Model United Nations Student Diplomat Program. This is a program that introduces nearly 700 middle school students from across the greater Philadelphia region to the topics of international affairs and cultural diplomacy. This year's program topics are building the sustainable cities of the future and creating sustainable food systems. So by now, all of the students in our program have probably received your program assignments. You know what countries you will be representing at the final conference and what topics you've been tasked to research in preparation for the final conference as well. Well, for our preparatory conference, which is a 3-part recording, we are actually going to accomplish a set of different goals. We are going to, in part 1, review the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to spend some time in part 1 also learning about and practicing parliamentary procedure. And then in parts 2 and parts 3, we will learn about resolutions, practice writing and amending resolutions, learn about the optional position paper requirement, and then we will also share some really helpful tips, tricks, and next steps for preparing for the final conference. So what will you need for today's virtual pre-recorded preparatory conference? Well, you'll need a couple of things. I think it will be helpful to have a pen or pencil, maybe some paper, or even a blank document open on your computer screen. I'll give you a second to do that. Additionally, we have a set of handouts that go along with our preparatory conference presentation. In parts 2 and 3, we will refer to those handouts, but you can access those handouts online on our website. Remember that we learned at the Cultural Diplomacy Conference back in January that being a successful diplomat requires being a good listener and a good speaker. So you'll want to both listen and take notes during our workshop today. And there's going to be certain parts of parts 2 and 3 that will require a little bit of engagement. So on your own and on your own time, you're going to want to be able to engage with that material as well. So let me go over a little bit of what our agenda for the prep conference looked like. If you attended our program virtually, it was a 3.5-hour program that featured these 3 different parts of our conference. We made the conference interactive by having a set of action items where students could raise their hands and unmute, participate in our chat, and spend some time writing. So you'll see these icons because they were built into our presentation when we delivered them live. But of course, if you're watching this from home, you can use these action items to respond and engage with our recordings as well. Okay, so we are going to get started with a little bit of review. And as you're watching this back, think back to the Cultural Diplomacy Conference, what we learned in January about the United Nations. Maybe you've also done a little bit of your own research about the United Nations since then. So go ahead and think to yourself, the United Nations was founded in 1945 to do just what? Why was 1945 such a significant time for the world and for the formation of an international organization like the United Nations? Well, if you said to promote world peace, to develop good relationships between countries, to promote cooperation in solving the world's problems, to encourage respect for and protection of human rights, these are all different items and goals as to why the United Nations was founded. Remember what we learned at the Cultural Diplomacy Conference. These goals are all rooted in the concept of diplomacy among member UN countries, and they are only possible. They can only be achieved through successful diplomacy. I love the photos on this slide here, photos from the United Nations when they were founded way back in 1945. So let's learn a little bit more about the United Nations. The United Nations is a big organization. They have a lot of goals, but they also have the responsibility to do what? I'll give you a second to think. Well, if you mentioned they deliver humanitarian aid after natural and man-made disasters. That is a very important fact, a very important responsibility that the United Nations has. In fact, in 2022, 274 million people around the world will need humanitarian assistance and protection. This number is the biggest number that it's been in decades. And the United Nations and all of the assortment of organizations and different chapters that are connected to the United Nations aim to assist millions of people in fighting hunger, preventing diseases, preventing violence and conflict all around the world. Additionally, the United Nations works to uphold international law. Maybe you've never heard of the phrase international law before. It's actually, if there's a threat to international peace and security anywhere in the world, the United Nations has the power to approve peacekeeping missions, send peacekeepers into conflict areas, or impose sanctions on countries. Additionally, the United Nations has a responsibility to promote sustainable development. Maybe you don't know what sustainable development is just yet. We will talk about that in just a second. And if you were to visit the United Nations website, you might see this mission statement on their website: peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. This leads us very nicely into the next part of our presentation, which is learning about the Sustainable Development Goals. So, have you heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? If you have, you might already know that they are 17 interconnected goals. These goals were adopted in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. Now, development must balance a couple of things. It has to balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And when you look at the 17 goals, you see that they all include some aspect of social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Now, the SDGs, as they are known, build on work that was already done by the United Nations and helps to guide the future work of the UN and all of its member countries. And if you were to visit the United Nations website and check out information on the Sustainable Development Goals, you might see this mission statement that they provide a shared blueprint or roadmap for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, both now and into the future. Here on our screen is a picture of the 17 interconnected Sustainable Development Goals. It's important to note that these are just goals, not specific policies. In fact, for the goals to be reached, everyone needs to do their part. That means governments, private companies and businesses, civil society, and students just like you. Now, why and how are the SDGs interconnected? Well, they're interconnected because a lack of progress on one of these goals actually hinders progress on another. Now, I'd ask you to think, in looking at these 17 goals, which two Sustainable Development Goals would be most closely related to this year's two committee topics of building the sustainable cities and communities of the future and creating sustainable food systems? I'll give you a second to take a look and think. Well, if you said goals number 2 and 11, then you were correct. Goal number 2, no hunger, and goal number 11, sustainable cities and communities. These goals relate most closely to our two topics for Junior Model UN this year. So what exactly is your role in all of this? We learned about the United Nations, we learned about the Sustainable Development Goals, but how does that pertain to you as a student delegate in this program? Well, think back to the Cultural Diplomacy Conference. We learned about our role in this program as delegates and diplomats. So essentially, you are serving as delegates from your assigned country at the Model United Nations final conferences, which will take place both in person and virtually in May and June. The final conferences will simulate or role play a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. This topic, the topic of this meeting is based on the overall topic, sustaining our global future, with special attention on creating sustainable food systems and building the sustainable cities of the future. As delegates in the Junior Model UN program, you will both debate and discuss one of these important global issues and work together to come up with solutions that can be implemented by the United Nations and its member countries. So it is time for a quiz. We love a good quiz at the World Affairs Council, especially when it tests your knowledge of international affairs, cultural diplomacy, and the United Nations. And that's what we're going to do right now. So in a couple of seconds, I'm going to show some quiz questions. I'm going to give you a second to think about your responses as you watch this recording, and then I'll share with you the answer to the question. So let's go ahead and get started and test your knowledge. Question number 1. When was the United Nations founded? Was it A, September 30th, 1901, B, October 24th, 1945, C, November 17th, 1990, or D, September 12th, 2001? Well, if you said B, October 24th, 1945, you would be correct. The United Nations very recently celebrated their 75th anniversary. Number 2, how many countries were the original founders of the United Nations? A, 51, B, 193, C, 60, or D, 74? Well, the correct answer is A, 51. 51 countries were the original founders of the United Nations. Number 3, what powers do the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have? A, the power to remove countries from the Security Council, B, the power to add countries to the Security Council, or C, veto power? So the correct answer is C, veto power. Now, while the Security Council cannot add or remove countries from the Security Council itself, they can actually recommend the admission of new UN member countries to the General Assembly, and they can also approve changes to the UN Charter. Which body of the United Nations includes all 193 member states? Is it A, the General Assembly, B, the Security Council, C, the Economic and Social Council, or D, none of the bodies of the UN include all 193 member states? I'll give you a hint. This is the body that we are simulating or role-playing in Junior Model UN. Well, the correct answer is A, the General Assembly. Number 5, what set of goals came before the Sustainable Development Goals? Is it A, none, B, the Millennium Development Goals, C, the 2015 Global Goals? Well, the correct answer is the Millennium Development Goals, letter B. The Millennium Development Goals were created in the year 2000 and had an end date of 2015. And they were just 8 goals. You know, the United Nations noticed that more progress needed to be made in more areas. So they created and more than doubled the goals that they had before to create the goals that we have today. Number 6, which Sustainable Development Goals most closely relate to this year's 2 committee topics? We answered this a little bit earlier. Is it A, SDG 2, Zero Hunger, B, SDG 4, Quality Education, C, SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, or D, both A and C? Well, the correct answer is D, both A, SDG 2, Zero Hunger, and C, SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, are the 2 SDGs that most closely relate to this year's committee topics. Number 7, how many people worldwide currently live in urban areas? Is it A, 75%, B, 37%, C, 55%, or D, 29%? Well, the correct answer is C, 55%, or a little more than half of the people worldwide currently live in urban areas. Number 8, what is the first step in a food system process? Is it A, preparation and consumption, B, production, D, distribution and transportation, or D, markets and purchasing? Well, the correct answer is B, production. Production is the first step in a food system process. Number 9, cities account for over 70% of worldwide resource use and blank percent of greenhouse gas emissions. Is it A, 75%, B, 98%, C, 34%, or D, 57%? Well, the correct answer is A. Cities account for over 70% of worldwide resource use and 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. Number 10, unsustainable agricultural practices currently account for blank percent of global biodiversity loss. Is it A, 100%, B, 48%, C, 15%, or D, 80%? The correct answer is D. Unsustainable agricultural practices currently account for 80% of global biodiversity loss. Number 11, which of these is not an agency or program associated with the United Nations? Is it A, the World Food Program, also known as WFP, B, the European Union, also known as the EU, C, the World Bank, or D, the Food and Agriculture Organization, also known as the FAO? Well, the correct answer is B. The European Union is not an agency or program associated with the United Nations. Number 12, true or false? Addressing climate change will help immensely to promote both sustainable cities and sustainable food systems. A, true, or B, false? The correct answer is A. It's true that addressing climate change will help immensely to promote both sustainable cities and sustainable food systems. So now that we've done our quiz and we've tested our knowledge about both United Nations and our 2 committee topics for this year, what is another word for the people who work at the United Nations? You might remember this from when we attended the Cultural Diplomacy Conference back in January. If you said delegates or diplomats, you are correct. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about diplomats and public speaking. Public speaking is a key component of Model UN. And if you're a student who is a little less than confident in your own public speaking skills, Model UN is a great chance to stretch those skills and flex those public speaking muscles. Why is practicing public speaking important for a Model UN student, delegate, or diplomat? Well, communication is one of the most important skills that a delegate or diplomat should have. It's also important to know who your fellow delegates are. By practicing public speaking, you can become confident both discussing and debating with your fellow delegates. Public speaking is also a key component of parliamentary procedure and helps you share your ideas clearly and efficiently with other delegates. If you don't know what parliamentary procedure is, we will get into that next. So what is parliamentary procedure? Well, we're going to start really basic with just a couple of key terms about who the key players are when it comes to Model UN. Parliamentary procedure is a set of rules that governs how committees speak or how meetings work, when a delegate may speak, and whom delegates may address. Parliamentary procedure is used by Model United Nations, of course, but it's also used by the US Congress, student government, city council, school boards, churches as well. So why do we use parliamentary procedure? Well, for a couple reasons. It produces quicker and more efficient meetings, keeps meetings organized, keeps delegates on track and on topic, protects each member's rights, allows everyone's voice to be heard, whether you are a small member country or a large member country, you have a vote and you have time to speak and be recognized. And also, it carries out the will of the majority when it comes to voting. Provides structure so that delegates can remain courteous and respectful to one another, the co-chairs and program designers. So how do we use parliamentary procedure? There are 2 roles that students and facilitators play during a Model United Nations. Delegates, which are all of our students in our program, represent their assigned countries. And then our chairs or co-chairs moderate the discussion and debate on the meeting topic. Just a quick review, our chairs are actually trained university students who spend a significant amount of time doing Model United Nations at the college level. They travel all over the country and sometimes even the world to do Model United Nations conferences. And they're kind of similar to a referee. They keep track of time, they enforce rules and procedures, and they moderate what's going on in terms of the debate and discussion. And delegates, those are all of the students in our program, represent a country and then spend time debating, drafting, which means writing, and amending resolutions. So how do we use parliamentary procedure? Well, I'll give you a hint. There's a picture on the screen of a piece of cardstock with a country name and a country flag. Delegates have placards that indicate their country name. Delegates use their placards to vote or to show that they want to speak. And a placard is just a piece of cardstock with a country's name on it that delegates raise to signal that he or she wishes to speak. In Model UN, you don't just raise your hand to be called on, you raise your placard. How do we use parliamentary procedure? Well, there's a couple of different ways. The chair reads out the list of countries that are supposed to be in attendance at your committee meeting. Delegates must respond with present or present and voting to let the chair know that your country's delegation is in attendance. Try to practice roll call with your school group before the final conference. When you're at the final conferences, the co-chairs will call on your countries, and it's important that you and your country mates know exactly who will respond with present or present and voting. So just to review our other parliamentary procedure key term, roll call is when the chairs call out a list of names to determine who is present in terms of the countries. So how do we use parliamentary procedure? Well, as delegates, you have a couple different tools in your parliamentary procedure toolbox. Different types of meetings have different rules, goals, and outcomes. In parliamentary procedure, there are several key terms to make note of. A caucus is a meeting between a group of people with shared concerns. And there's two different types of caucuses when it comes to Model UN. A moderated caucus is a formal debate and discussion that's led by co-chairs. In a moderated caucus, the co-chair enforces the rules of procedure, very similar to how a referee does during a sports game. Co-chairs will actually use what's called a speakers list to ensure that everyone has had a chance to speak and that delegates are being encouraged to raise points or motions during this time. Put simply, a moderated caucus is very similar to having to raise your hand in class and waiting to be called on by your teacher. Only you have to raise your placard and be called on by the co-chair. In an unmoderated caucus, delegates are expected to engage actively by walking around and discussing the topic with other delegates. Although the co-chairs keep track of time during an unmoderated caucus, the rules of procedure are generally not enforced. During an unmoderated caucus, delegates will discuss and gather support for draft resolutions and review the work being done with other groups. So, how do we practice parliamentary procedure? Well, raising points helps delegates communicate with one another and with the chairs. Communication is especially important during moderated caucus meetings when there is a limited amount of time for delegates to speak or debate on an important issue. Communication is important for both in-person and virtual conferences and meetings. It's important when students and many people have to have rules in order to successfully communicate with one another. We encourage you all to practice parliamentary procedure by using points and motions in your Model United Nations sessions at school. So in terms of points, there are several different types of points, and they are essentially just questions or concerns that delegates may raise with the chair. A point of order is called or used when you believe a mistake was made with regards to the rules of procedure. A point of inquiry is used when you have a question about the rules of parliamentary procedure. And point of personal privilege is used when you are experiencing some sort of discomfort or are being unable to hear another delegate. Now let's talk about motions. Motions actually help delegates communicate with one another and with the chair. There's a couple different motions that you can do in Model United Nations. Motion is a proposal by a delegate that the committee takes a certain action. So you as a delegate have a lot of power. You can make the entire committee session all do the same thing at the same time. You can motion to open or close a committee session. You can also motion for lunch or for a break. You can motion for a moderated caucus, a formal discussion, or a motion for an unmoderated caucus, an informal discussion. Now, let's practice and review. Let's try officially opening our committee. What would we say? We would motion to open. If you have a question about parliamentary procedure, you'd call for a point of inquiry. If you want to practice raising your placard or the raise hand function, We could also take a break by using parliamentary procedure and motioning to do so. You can motion for break or use point of personal privilege. Well, thank you all so much for participating in part 1 of our virtual preparatory conference. It was such a pleasure to have you join us today. Stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 to learn more about the preparatory conference program and to prepare for the final conference. Thank you.